Hello everyone, I'm Bruffy1322 and this video will showcase the fastest cars in the GTA 5 off-road class, organised first of all by race tier and then by lap time within each tier, with the top speed of each vehicle also shown in order to identify any outliers. All 61 off-road vehicles have been put through their paces on my testing track and top speed run, and we'll be going from the slowest O tier cars to the top S tier in this video. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on future testing of new vehicles added to GTA 5 and beyond, and check out all of the classes in the playlist. This video is brought to you by GTAcars.net, the best place for GTA vehicle info that I own and run. The latest major update added a comparison tool which allows you to compare multiple vehicles side by side on all metrics. Navigate to the Compare Vehicles page in the GTA 5 section of GTAcars.net to get started. So as we see the vehicles in the off-roads class that aren't usable in regular races, it's important for me to let you know that the intro video to this series, which is linked in the description and pinned comment, likely answers any questions you have about this testing. From simple things like what car upgrades are needed to maximise performance and what HSW stands for, to more complicated things like why I use off-road wheels and overall testing methodologies. Give that video a watch if there's anything you don't understand here, since everything there is assumed knowledge for this video. So here we are finally with the off-roads class, and what a pain this has been to get out. The off-roads class is basically a completely mixed up mess of raceable vehicles, non-raceable vehicles, cars from other classes that can be used in off-road class races, cars where the fully upgraded version can't be used but the stock version can. It's a headache basically. It's also a massive class with 61 vehicles in the class proper and a further 11 from other classes that can be used in off-road races. So sorry that it's taken so long to get this one out since we last saw a testing video with the open wheel cars. But as we see these non-raceable vehicles first, I'm going to quickly go over the vehicles that can only be used in off-road races in their stock forms directly from the race lobby screen. These include the Dubster and Mesa SUVs, Manches Scout Bike, and Mariachi Tornado Sport Classic, as well as the Menacer from the off-road class itself. Now, since I only test fully upgraded vehicles, there won't be lap times for these stock vehicles in this video. Just be aware that their stock versions are usable from the vehicle selection screen in off-road races, and a general rule to see where they'd fall is to add about 4 to 5 seconds to their fully upgraded lap times from their class specific videos. The other 7 vehicles that aren't in the off-road class but can still be used in off-road races in their fully upgraded personal vehicle form are the Old Baller and Patriot SUVs, BF400 and Sanchez bikes, Guardian industrial vehicle and Paradise van, as well as the Service Class June, which, while selectable only as a stock vehicle, can't get upgrades anyway since the version you own is a Pegasus vehicle, so its stock form is by definition fully upgraded already. Those vehicles you will see during this video in the relevant tiers for their performance, and hopefully you can already get a feel for how much of a headache this class is and has been to test and sort. So the spoilered ramp buggy here, it's only used in one mission and it's mostly the same as the regular ramp buggy, just that it doesn't get any upgrades and isn't attainable in any way to own. Its lack of upgrades like engine, transmission, turbo is what gives it worse performance than the normal ramp buggy, and the spoiler doesn't give it any extra traction, it's just visual. It's kind of a weird addition. And as we come on to the top 3 of the non-raceable off-road class vehicles, it's actually quite interesting how close they are, with only a 1/10 of a second separating each of them from the ramp buggy to the Sasquatch, from the Sasquatch to the Blazer Aqua in the top spot. It's crazy how they are such different vehicles and get their speeds in very different ways, but ultimately achieve essentially the same track performance and the same sort of lap time. Anyway, it's time for the 45 raceable off-road vehicles, plus the 7 vehicles from the other classes, all organised in the usual tier system, starting with Tier O. And the Jabba didn't used to be raceable, but it was made so relatively recently, and it holds the distinction of being the slowest fully upgradable vehicle in the entire game for top speed, with only 62.25 miles per hour, despite getting engine, transmission, turbo upgrades and all that stuff. It does mean though that the Winky is no longer the slowest raceable car in the class. However, you'd still want to use the 2013 June loader if you ever did an O tier race. Whether you'd actually want to do an O tier off-road race is entirely your decision, but ultimately these are the slowest raceable vehicles in the class. The N tier has our first vehicles from other classes, starting with the Paradise Van, which is definitely more of a spice pick, given that it is a little bit off the pace. And also a spice pick for this tier is the Lifeguard Blazer that we'll see next. Although the Lifeguard Blazer is easy to drive and quite easy to maximize, as well as being quite small, so that might be an advantage in certain situations, but ultimately these first two are quite significantly off the pace of what we'll see later on in the tier. The Patriot is our first SUV to be available for off-road races, and it's a normal SUV. We've seen it in the SUVs testing video. It's one of the slowest in the SUVs class. It's one of the slowest in the off-road raceable class. But the Rancher XL is probably the most normal car for this tier, and probably also the best pick in most situations. It's well rounded for the tier as a whole. Ultimately the quickest is the Verus, but it can be a bit annoying to drive with getting caught on curbs, and its top speed is also a big weakness for it. So as we see some more of the slower vehicles in the class, and we also see some slower vehicles from other classes like the old Baller from the SUVs class, this is where we'll also see the Guardian industrial vehicle and the June service vehicle in not too long. I just want to quickly go back to the 16 non-raceable off-road vehicles that we saw earlier on. That is the largest number of non-raceable cars for any raceable class in the game, and in reality there's no real reason why most of those vehicles shouldn't just be usable in regular off-road races instead of being left to transform races or special vehicle races. As long as any weapons are disabled, most of them would actually be great additions to regular races, and especially in terms of their lap times would fit in nicely with some of the vehicles that we're seeing in these tiers that we're seeing here to flesh them out a little bit more and just give some more options. I would say with the notable exceptions of the ramp buggies and the arena vehicles, because they're a little bit extra in terms of the things that the havoc that they could cause in regular races. It's just a shame that most of the non-raceable stuff in the off-roads class could be made raceable. Obviously they did it with the Jabba, that went from non-raceable to raceable. They also did it with the Night Shark, which we'll see later on in the video. I would like to see them do it with more of the non-raceable stuff. And yeah, I think it would just really make the off-roads class even more interesting, because at the moment we're left with just 45 of the 61 total off-road vehicles that we can use in regular races together. So obviously at this point you've also seen that I'm taking these cars around my regular testing track like I do with everything else. So to get ahead of the whole why don't you test on an off-road track question, the reason is because off-road is just a name, like any other class name. Sports cars can be raced off-road in the same way that off-road cars can be raced on-road. My testing aims to test everything in the same way so it can be compared across classes. If I tested all of these cars on a different track, you'd suddenly not be able to compare how fast they are to anything else in this series, which negates the whole point. Having said that, the ordering of this list would largely be the same when it was tested off-road anyway. The fastest cars here will still be the fastest in an off-road situation. The main thing that needs to be considered when driving any car in an off-road race, and this goes for all classes, not just this one, is the vehicle's off-road traction loss. This is a value usually between 0 and 1, with most normal cars having a value of 1. The closer the value is to 0, the better the car performs off-road. It's why in the sports class, the Omnis, which has a lap time around 1.5 seconds slower than a Sultan in my testing on a normal road, will actually perform better than it off-road, since the Omnis's off-road traction loss value is only 0.4, whereas the Sultan is the normal 1. Essentially, the Sultan loses a lot more speed off-road because of that higher value. Now, the thing that sets apart the off-road class is the fact that most cars in this class have low off-road traction loss values, making them lose less speed in an off-road situation in comparison to other classes where most cars have a value of 1 and it's the odd outliers like rally cars that have lower values. But within the off-road class only, most vehicles have these decent values, so between themselves within the off-road class it all ends up about even. And apart from one car, which I'll mention when we get to it, all of the higher off-road traction loss vehicles are already some of the slowest in the class anyway. But you can always look up these off-road traction loss values for yourself on GTAcars.net to paint your own picture and make your own informed decisions, using this testing as a springboard for that. Basically, look at the off-road traction loss value for a car. The closer it is to 0, the better it will be off-road. The closer it is to 1, or even some cars have higher than 1, the worse it will be off-road. And that applies to all cars in all classes, and it's why we have some cars that are good in an off-road situation in the sports class, like the Omnis, like the Tropos, because they're sports cars, but they've got low off-road traction loss values, so they're good off-road and better than things that are quicker than it with higher off-road traction loss values. So we're up to tier G now, and this does the classic pattern where lap times improve as top speed gets worse. However, that 7th best top speed for the Boer doesn't really do much to help it, since this is the car that I was talking about that has the highest off-road traction loss value in the class, with 0.85. Only 6 other vehicles have a value greater than 0.5, and they're all 0.8, so the Boer stands alone at the bottom with the worst value. It's also a bit of an annoying car to drive in general, even on roads, and certainly won't do well in an actual off-road race in comparison to the vehicles around it for lap time. The Outlaw at the top of the tier might be grippy but has awful top speed, so in most cases the all-rounder Hellion will be the best pick for races that are restricted to the G tier. Next up is tier F, which is the biggest and probably most interesting in the class, with 6 vehicles, all separated by just over half a second from top to bottom. Although I wouldn't recommend the Everon, as it's not a great driving experience, while the Caracara 4x4 and new Yosemite 1500 are slightly off the pace, even if still usable. The most interest in this tier comes from the top 3, with the Walton L35 in 3rd being the best all-rounder in the same way that the Hellion was in tier G, and the Dune Buggy in the top spot being the very grippy option with not much straight line speed, again similar more to the Outlaw from the previous tier. The iconic Brawler sits in between those two in 2nd place for the tier, and is notorious for being bad at braking, having a top 3 in class top speed, coupled with being one of the small number of vehicles without ABS. But if you don't add any brake upgrades in Los Santos Customs and then only tickle the brake pedal, and I'm talking only like 10 to 20% force on the trigger, it will actually brake quite well and give it a very good lap time. The Brawler doesn't have the grip of some of the cars in this tier, but it will be very quick if it can be mastered depending on the track, mainly because of that top speed. The difficulty in mastering it is why I'm happy to have it in this tier, despite it being near the top and having such a top speed advantage, which might ordinarily suggest that it should be moved up. And if you're on PC using keyboard where the brakes are either 100% on or off, just don't even bother trying, choose something else. Honestly though, the Brawler wouldn't be able to compete in tier E anyway, for which the Bifter is usually the best overall, as we take a massive jump in lap time of 1.2 seconds from the Dune Buggy. The Hot Rod and regular Blazers that make up the rest of tier E are identical in terms of performance, although the body shape of the regular version does allow it to be a little bit more consistent and easier to maximize, just due to the mass distribution across the body. Remember also that leaning forward is quicker on all of the Blazers and the Verus as well. They basically can't decide whether they want to be bikes or cars, so you get a bit of both with the Blazers. Okay, so we're getting up at the sharp end now with tier D, and we're getting another big jump of lap time to 106 with the Night Shark, our newest convert from non-raceable to raceable vehicle. And again, the Night Shark has weapons, but they just disabled them, and now it can be used in regular races, and I don't see why they can't do that with a lot of the other vehicles. It's a relatively nice car to drive, the Night Shark, but it is a little bit off the pace from the top 2 in this tier, which are also basically the same in terms of performance. You can make your choice whichever one you want between the Trophy Truck and the Desert Raid. You're going to get the same performance from both of them, and they're just such iconic vehicles for the class. We're into the top 10 now for lap time with these two, and yeah, such wonderful vehicles to race with and a hell of a lot of fun for off-road races. We move swiftly on to tier C. Now both tiers B and C only have 2 vehicles in them each. We start with the Monstrosity in tier C. It's about 0.2 of a second slower than what we'll see just after it. And this is obviously the non-HSW version of the car. When HSW is turned off, your monstrosity is going to be in about 8th place for the class, just a little bit behind the Ratel, another one of the newer vehicles, which is basically a trophy truck but has a little bit of a higher top speed. So it's you know, it's a little bit quicker, and it certainly is a tier above the trophy truck in the Desert Raid, but it's not that much quicker. For tier B, we've got quite a surprise with a big jump of lap time as well for the Street Blazer. Now the Blazers are just so quick around the corners, that's where they get their lap time from, but they're always really bad in top speed, so 100 miles per hour isn't that great, even though it almost got into the top 5 for lap time. It's very grippy, and it just depends on the situation whether you'll be able to maximize that. Most of the time for B tier races you're going to want to use the Camacho, which is just a bit off the pace of the A tier cars these days. It used to be the quickest in the off-roads class, but yeah, it's still a very competent vehicle and very fun to drive, but it just can't match some of the A tier vehicles. Speaking of the A tier vehicles, we've got a brand new car to start us off with the Terminus. Now the Terminus is very quick and easy to drive as well. It's got good acceleration, grip and overall speed. It's kind of like a smaller Camacho, and it's good in many areas, but it doesn't really excel in any. To be honest, it's basically a slightly easier to drive Vagrant, which we'll see soon, but the trade-off for that is that it's also slightly slower for both lap time and top speed. Certainly a good all-rounder for the class though when HSW is turned off. Now the original fastest vehicle to use in off-road races back in 2013 is up next, and still good enough for 5th overall for off-road class races, despite never being in the off-road class itself. The Sanchez is of course a bike, and with that comes good cornering ability and good top speed thanks to the wheelie. The Vagrant up next has great top speed and the best overall for the class when HSW isn't considered, but the car can be inconsistent and difficult to get the lap time from. It swaps between understeer and snap oversteer, but as long as you brake in a straight line and don't get the power on too early in the corner, it will be a very quick car overall. But the clear winner for the A tier and the class as a whole when HSW is turned off is the Draugr. A full 1.5 seconds per lap quicker than the Vagrant is huge, and it's clearly the car to choose for most situations if HSW is off. However, it is still only in the A tier, and that's because it has one big weakness: its top speed. We'll talk more about the A tier later because it's top S tier time now, and we start with a vehicle that's topped the class for a long time now, the BF400. The usability of bikes is very dependent on the track, with some off-road races going through water and rendering them useless, or some races in general not allowing them to wheelie, which is a big requirement to get that crazy top speed, but it remains in the top tier since while it may be 0.2 slower than the Draugr for lap time that we just saw, it has a nearly 15 mph top speed advantage and would dominate the A tier if it was left there. However, it's nice to see these days that an actual off-road class vehicle is at the top of the off-road class rather than a bike. And with the monstrosity matching the super high top speed of the BF400 without needing to wheelie, while also having similar cornering ability and better acceleration, it's not difficult to see why. Obviously this speed comes from its HSW upgrades, since we saw the non-HSW version earlier in the video, so HSW needs to be turned on in any given race for the car to be usable in this form. Nevertheless, a 1 minute lap time from an off-road vehicle is crazy, and it's almost 2 seconds per lap and 15 mph for top speed, quicker than the next best proper off-road car of the Draugr. Although when comparing them, you can also see why the Draugr itself is so good, as it is able to somewhat keep up with its grip in the corners. Now, I think the most interesting thing to talk a little bit more about at the end of this video is that A tier, and specifically the 3 cars. You've got the Terminus, which will always be competitive regardless of the track type, while some of the other A tier vehicles are better in some situations than others. The Vagrant, which perhaps isn't as well suited to an off-road situation due to being quite low to the ground, although its off-road traction loss is the lowest of the top off-road vehicles at 0. And you've got the Draugr, which will get eaten up if there's any amount of decently long top speed sections. The balance from the A tier comes from the most consistent car being slightly slower, with the fastest cars having their own strengths and weaknesses. Obviously, in most non-HSW off-road class races, the Draugr is the one to pick, as it's an absolute monster overall with incredible grip and ability to handle off-road situations well, given its very compliant suspension, but that won't always be the case. Between the 3 A-tier off-road class vehicles, the Vagrant and the Terminus don't have any traction bonus from a spoiler, and that's ultimately where the lap time difference comes from. However, it does at least allow some balance given the top speed of both and the general well-roundedness of the terminus. While in most instances the Drago is going to be the one to pick, especially for an off-road situation, it is quite bulky and it does have a terrible top speed, meaning that it's not going to be perfect in every situation. The Vagrant's top speed can definitely rein the Drago in if it's allowed to, and the Terminus's general jack of all trades, master of none aspects will allow some players to do well with it despite it being off the ultimate pace, especially since it also has a top speed advantage over the Drago as well and is significantly easier to handle than the Vagrant, especially off-road. So as usual with the off-road class, a lot is determined by the type of race being run. On-road or off-road, enough straights for top speed have an impact, or short, tight corners everywhere, ability for bikes to wheelie a lot or even complete the course at all if water is present. There's a lot more variables for off-road races, and the vehicles available in the off-road class lean into that more so than the other classes. But in the end, just like with most of the classes these days, it's an HSW car that you're going to want to pick if you're allowed to. And there we go. The off-road class is finally done. Hopefully this video has been helpful and finally answered your burning questions regarding this class and some of the newer vehicle additions added to it, like the Terminus. I also hope that seeing what a big old mess this class is, along with the sheer size of it in terms of raceable and non-raceable vehicles, has given a little bit of understanding as to why this has been a bit of a bottleneck in these 2024 testing videos. I am expecting the remaining classes, which are utility, commercial, industrial, service, emergency and military, to all happen a bit quicker now, even if there are a few extra hoops to jump through in order to test all the vehicles, since most of them at this point won't be usable in races. At least they're all significantly smaller classes than this one. But that's everything for this video. Please consider supporting on Patreon or become a YouTube member if you want to support this work and get some extra perks for doing so, such as early access to videos and other testing results. Also remember to read the description for more info, comment with your thoughts, like the video if you enjoyed it, found it helpful, and subscribe for more. Thank you all so much for watching as always, and I'll see you next time.